Hello, everybody, and welcome to Some Patchers Required, a show where we hope to educate and entertain you on the ever-turbulent games industry. As always, my name is Zach, and I'm one of your hosts.
And as always, I am your other host, Aaron.
And this week is particularly exciting for a few reasons. One, we're going to be talking a little bit about Baldur's Gate, and Aaron and I, as both, pretty big D&D fans, see our earlier episode in Season 2.
With undercommon
that's
taste.
kind of exciting. And also, it's our last episode of Season 2 as well. So just wanted to make that quick call out. We want to make some structural changes. Well, not so much structural changes, but just get some bigger episodes that we've had planned for a lot of Season 2 in place. And following kind of the normal recording process that we've normally been following makes it a little bit hard to do that.
Yeah. We have some fairly ambitious stuff planned for a handful of episodes, a lot of which include guests that, scheduling across 3 time zones can be a little bit difficult, and some of the topics might include multiple guests. And we wanted to make sure that we could do those episodes justice, so that way your ears don't hurt when you have to listen to them, and having a little bit of time where we don't have to follow a strict recording schedule, so we can get those planned, recorded, organized, all that fun stuff, is going to be super helpful for us. So we will return, but not in 2 weeks.
Yep. And we'll keep everybody posted on the social media and all that in terms of what our plans there are.
Speaking of which, since we have Twitter, I was going to say, is it called Xing now? Do we
I don't
send
know
an
that
X?
there's a consistent vernacular or lexicon that's been invented for the new porn site x.com. But I'll make sure to let everyone know when I do know. Just like I wanted to make sure to let everyone know that we are thankful for all of the new and returning fans. We really appreciate you. If you're new, of course, make sure that you listen to the rest of Season 2. We're pretty happy with the overall output of this season, especially compared to the first one. Not that we did a bad job in the first one, but I think we really kind of found our voice in some ways that weren't present in the initial season. But regardless, please give us a like, subscribe, or feel free to share us with some of your friends, family, whatever, anyone that you think would like us. We definitely appreciate any kind of support that can be given.
Absolutely. And a positive review on any of the platforms that support reviews always helps. It pushes us up in charts, and if people see that other people like the show, it's a lot more likely that they're going to actually click on our humble show. So, yeah, thank you to everybody. And I promise we won't be gone too long.
And without any further ado, we're going to be talking about Baldur's Gate, what Michael from Bellular has referred to as a game of the generation, or at least for the decade. A game that has 75 to 100 hours of gameplay and apparently roughly 17 different endings. Of course, there's actually more variations than that, Aaron. It's just kind of like, I forgot the exact words to describe. It's functionally, you make a lot of choices in the game, so some of the endings are not all that different. Like, there is technically variance, but the variance isn't huge. My understanding is there's 17, though, that are, like, significantly different.
Now, that's the fun thing, because I actually just had been reviewing the research materials that we were looking at, and we'll give some context for Baldur's Gate 3 here in just one sec. But I was going to say, when I was watching it, it actually said 17,000 variations on the ending. Minute.
Oh, did it say 1,000? I just deleted that in the notes because I thought that was me being dumb.
Variations on the ending, which is, and again, some of those are very minute because all of the choices you make compound. So the variations are so tremendously minimal that, we're not talking about the polar opposite of a Mass Effect 3 situation, BioWare reference. And you know, we're not talking about something that has like infinite possibility or something like that. We're talking about something where very, very small things. It could just be, a word in the text box, or, a very, very small detail in the background or something like that that's generated based on your choices. But if I'm not terribly mistaken, and I will feel like a complete asshole if I am, Michael from Bellular did say 17,000.
Well, whether it be 17 or 17,000,
That's still
I
a
do
lot
think
of
it was over
endings.
17. That's a pretty impressive amount of ending content. Of course, like we've kind of saying, what matters more is kind of the unique endings. But I'm not at all surprised to see that there is that much content, because for context for those listening, I've got over 40 hours in Baldur's Gate 3 now. I'm in like at least 4 campaigns, I think. I've played the beginning area quite a bit, but it is a great game. And I've been enjoying a lot as a D&D fan, and apparently a lot of other people have been enjoying it a lot because what is it? Open Critic, top critic average of 97%, same thing on Metacritic, and everyone would recommend the game. I think the user score on Metacritic, if I'm not mistaken, Aaron, was a 91%, and then on
Yeah, I
Steam
believe
it
it's
is an
9.1.
overwhelmingly
Yeah.
positive.
Yes, no, that's
94.
definitively overwhelmingly positive. And I was very excited to play this game because I had actually played the original Baldur's Gate. I let me tell you a fun story about the time that I did actually buy a disc for a PC game. There's been several of those. Also, apparently Titan Quest 2 is coming out at some point. That's wild.
I don't even think I
But
know what Titan Quest is. I'd have to look that up on the internet.
Titan Quest I had in like it was almost like one of those puffy VHS cases for a PC game. It's another RPG. It's kind of like it was almost an RTS is what it kind of felt like at the time, but it's been now probably fully 17 years since I played the game.
Well,
But
apparently, after 17 years, it's been announced, according to Insider Gaming. The Titan Quest 2 has been announced after 17 years. So,
wow, okay, I
yeah.
accidentally no scoped that one. But no, the idea of playing Baldur's Gate, because the original one was a revolution when it came out, and I did not get to play number 2. But when I played the first one, that game has aged like if you've ever bought like flatbread, like non bread, and you leave it in your pantry for one day too long, it just gets covered in mold. That's how well Baldur's Gate, the original, has aged, like visually and experientially. It is not a modern experience, but at the time, it was an absolute revolution. So the idea of playing Baldur's Gate 3 to me was actually very appealing. I'm like, I'm willing to shell out for this. I like Larian. I know this one's not being made by BioWare, but BioWare has stopped making this style of RPG a long time ago. I saw a bunch of comparisons to Dragon Age Origins and got very excited about that. And so I said, you know what, I'm going to download it. And just as kind of my closing bit on this particular humorous anecdote, I did start downloading it about 5 days ago. And as of 12:25 this morning, the download had completed on my Steam Deck.
Yeah,
So
I mean, to
I
be
have
fair,
not had a chance to play the game.
you have a few factors going against you. One being your horrendous internet connection, and also I can't help but feel like the fact that you're downloading it onto your Steam Deck. I mean, I don't know. Maybe that actually doesn't make a difference as compared to like a desktop tower. But for some reason in my mind, it's like that might take a little bit longer.
I would be surprised if downloading onto the Steam Deck took considerably longer than downloading onto any other device, based purely on my experience with different Wi-Fi speeds in the course of my travels around this world, and my experience with hardware. No, but so I am approaching this conversation mostly from an observational standpoint as opposed to an experiential one. But it is my Steam Deck is actually sitting directly next to me, and if we can get this recording done in a reasonable time frame, I will absolutely be playing some Baldur's Gate 3. I'm very
Yeah.
excited to play it, and by all accounts, again, it does seem to be just an exceptionally good, not just game, but polished, finished AAA project built in a world that has been up until recently fairly inaccessible to a lot of people, and it seems to be kind of an outlier in a lot of ways. And to kind of compare it, because to another game that I've been playing a lot of, and I've already put more than 100 hours into, which is Tears of the Kingdom. We've already talked about that. Refer to our previous episode. That game had Nintendo polish and zero microtransaction opportunity. And it currently sits at 1 point lower than Baldur's Gate 3 on Metacritic. Which means I think Baldur's Gate 3 is tied with Breath of the Wild. And that's an achievement, in my opinion. It makes me very excited to actually get my hands on the game.
Yeah, I mean, it's Baldur's Gate 3 is definitely a crazy game to have come out. I mean, I think the interesting thing is it's an independent studio. Larian is a large studio, but it is an independent studio. They weren't beholden to like publisher deadlines, and obviously that's that's kind of a positive thing. But at the same time, that means that they didn't really have some of the revenue resources or even potentially marketing resources that you can get from working with a publisher. But kind of the neat thing, and this is brought up in a Bellular video, is it really is like a perfect storm for them. They've worked on basically only CRPGs the entirety of the studio's lifetime, whether that be the Divinity series or Baldur's Gate 3. I think there's some other games that they've worked on, but basically everybody at the studio knows how to make CRPGs, and they know how to develop for these kind of games in terms of like the tool sets that they need. And I think this game was in development for 6 years, which is kind of crazy.
Yes,
I mean, that's a
it was
pretty long
6 year.
period of time.
Yeah. I believe it was a 6-year development cycle. Which,
it was like 6 years of development, 3 years in early access.
That is my understanding, yes. Because the first time I'd heard about the fact that they were making Baldur's Gate 3, I was like, well, BioWare back at it again. And then I was like, oh, wait, no, it's Larian. And then I got very happy. Not because I think BioWare has unilaterally sucked. I have enjoyed so many BioWare games. But I went, oh, okay, I've played the original Baldur's Gate. BioWare has moved away from this type of game. And if there's one studio that I could have picked to make a successor to those original kind of groundbreaking D&D, overtly D&D based BioWare RPG style games, it would have been Larian. I would have, because I played Divinity Original Sin 2, not as much as you, Zach. I know you played it a lot more than I have, but I thought that game was fantastic. And I was like, oh man, this is a wild thing made by the exact right team.
And I think kind of, well, one, you're right. I have PTSD from how much I've played Divinity 2, if I'm being honest. And I still like the game, but dear Lord. I will say the interesting thing about Baldur's Gate that kind of largely ties it into the bigger subject of this discussion, which is us talking about, okay, why is Baldur's Gate performing so well? And yet we see all these kind of like AAA blunders and disappointments throughout the industry. There have been people online talking about the fact that Baldur's Gate shouldn't be used as a example to be held against, other RPG games or AAA games. And basically what I mean by that is some people, I think, do mean it in good faith. They basically are saying like this was a perfect storm. They had 6 years of development. There were all of these unique situations that just aren't present for a lot of AAA games. And, because of that, don't look down upon upcoming releases for maybe not having the amount of content, the number of hours, all of that Baldur's Gate has. And it's interesting because actually the first time that I happened upon this, Aaron, it was because of that IGN video that I found. And I think that IGN video takes a very cynical stance on it towards developers. And they do kind of, I think, blame all developers. It's much more of a consumer-focused video. But then if you watch Michael's video, the Baldur video, he talks about it. And I think he has a much more grounded perspective on it, which I think I probably do share, which is to say, I do think a lot of things kind of just fell in place in Baldur's Gate, or fell in place for Larian to be successful with Baldur's Gate. But I don't think that a lot of studios have all of the positive tailwinds that this game had. And I don't know how many of these kind of games that we'll see, because 75 to 100 hours, that's a ton of play time. Like, that's a ridiculous amount of content that's in this game. And obviously it deserves all the praise for that. But I do kind of understand some people's concerns that this game may just be held up against every other AAA game, and used to kind of, shaft all of them. Or candidly, any game in general. But at the same time, I do think it's a bit of a weird controversy that we have going on, where some people, I do think, on the development side are kind of reacting in bad faith and are like, yeah, no, Baldur's Gate, like, it's being carried by the D&D IP, da-di-da-di-da, and they're just kind of trying to shit on it. There definitely is a little bit of that, but I definitely don't think it's the majority of the development community doing that kind of behavior.
No, I would completely agree. So I think there are a couple of important points to make here at this particular time in the recording. The first one being that I think I probably fall somewhere in the middle, because my favorite IGN video host, what's his face, was definitely falling down a rabbit hole of just kind of blaming the standard AAA studio mechanics that make those games kind of come out either unfinished or slightly homogenized or being blatant cash grabs. Whereas, not all of them do that. But I also think that he brought up a good argument, which is, why shouldn't the bar be raised? And I don't recall there being a time when Breath of the Wild came out and more or less completely changed the way that huge studios, approached their open world designs. None of these complaints were ever really levied against that game. It wasn't like, hey, don't look at Breath of the Wild as an example for what you should expect from a game. It was feature complete at launch. It was single player, and the only thing you had to pay extra for was DLC or a collector's edition at pre-launch.
Yeah.
That kind of complaint wasn't, kind of sent in the direction of Breath of the Wild. This one seems to be kind of an interesting, weird controversy. But I also do think that Baldur brought up a good point, or not. His name is not Is his name Baldur?
No, that's the name of the studio.
Yeah, but I mean, like, is his last name Baldur?
No, I don't know what his last name is.
Okay.
Well, I could look it up on Twitter, but
I'm sorry.
X.com,
you meant to say X. Yeah, which is so much easier to say, but and not confusing at all. No, but they brought up some good points in there where they were saying, yeah, there are constraints on studios that aren't independent that will impact the development of the game. The interesting one was, for me, a reference to Mass Effect 3, which had a notoriously short development cycle.
Yeah.
And the idea that EA was basically pushing for that meant that BioWare had almost no choice but to comply. if they wanted the funding to make the game, to sell the game. And in my opinion, I know this is contentious, but Mass Effect 3 is actually a very good game. Talk about the ending all you want, it doesn't matter. But the fact that they, had those constraints, it means that, it wasn't going to work. And then they talked about Anthem, which is another one that BioWare famously flubbed. And that one obviously had a fully troubled production cycle from day one. But that is mostly the result of mismanagement and studio issues. Baldur's Gate doesn't have to deal with an EA. It doesn't have to deal with an Activision. It doesn't have to deal with a Blizzard. Larian can just make their stuff as long as they got the money. As long as they have the money.
They do have to deal with Wizards of the Coast and the IP. So there is some IP licensing that they but yeah.
That is an important caveat, and Wizards of the Coast can be persnickety, to say it nicely.
Can send Pinkertons after you.
Yes,
They've been
known
known to do that on occasion.
They have been known to do that. That's I said persnickety to say it nicely. It was the nicest word I could find. But yeah, outside of that, like licensing costs, as long as they can secure the funding, they have the team, they have the time, they have the funding. And what apparently they made, I can't say from experience, is just this, beautiful crystallized example of what everyone's ever wanted out of a Dungeons and Dragons video game, which is famously, for me at least, a thing that is impossible to do. And I brought this up on the show, I believe, during our episode with Undercommon Taste, another podcast that we had on as guests this season, where I was talking about being a programming tutor, and I asked the guy what he wanted to make, like what was his ideal, and he's like, I want to make a Dungeons and Dragons game, but in VR, and you can do whatever you want. And I went, well, that's basically impossible, and I don't think Baldur's Gate's going to change that. But the idea of making a as close to limitless as possible, polished Dungeons and Dragons game in a virtual environment is something that maybe not all studios can do, but I think that's more or less on the studio, not on the developers. There's not a lack of talent.
Yeah,
it's a lack of autonomy and time.
I will say, to your point, Baldur's is very much a video game. So the interesting thing is, like, people going in and expecting a full D&D experience. It'll get you probably about 75% of the way there. But it is a video game, and because it's a video game, there are restrictions. So there was one sequence of events, and I'm going to be so vague that it's not a spoiler, but functionally the scenario was like, there was a character we wanted to save. We knew we wanted to save them, but we chose a dialogue option that we thought would help us save them. And by all means, it should have helped us save them. But for some reason, the character ended up, like, I guess it wasn't in their favor enough to justify them wanting to help us. And so they started aggroing us. And then we started attacking the people that were attacking them to try and be like, hey, we're on your side. And it didn't work. And in D&D, that would be such an easy scenario for a DM to get you out of. You could just literally talk to the character. There are so many different ways to get out of it. Like, there is so much creativity and what's the word? Just on the moment, gameplay flexibility that you can improv that you can utilize in D&D, and that isn't present in this game. So there are things that it's just not going to be able to do. To your point about kind of like developing one of these titles, it is a video game first, but it does do a really solid job of like emulating the dice rolls, but also getting rid of some of the more mundane side like of D&D that makes combat take 5 years and some of those things. It streamlines classes by, not having every single subclass that you could have, which I'm sure some people are probably actually upset about to some degree. But it's a pretty impressive feat. I do want to mention, though, because, our main focus here is to kind of compare and contrast it to some games that haven't done as well. You're talking about feature complete, Aaron.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably one of the big reasons we see a lot of not very good AAA games lately is a lot of games don't release feature complete. And obviously Anthem came out a while ago at this point, but Anthem's a great example of a game that had to have a post-launch roadmap in order to get more content into the game to make sure people had a game to play.
Yeah. Well, I would say, like, looping back just for like 2 seconds, I would just say my final caveat on the D&D thing as it translates to video games is that the mechanics themselves are so based on improvisation that the reason D&D works is it lacks a codified visual component, right? There's no, you don't have to animate. If your little item on the little grid map that you have wants to go this way, you tell it to go that way, that's fine. That's the only visual component there is to the game. Outside of that, it's just playing around with people. You can strip rules, you can add rules, you can change the setting, you can do whatever you want. That's just not possible in a video game to make endless possibility, which is what D&D offers. And then the feature complete issue, yeah, there are so many issues. Anthem felt mostly pretty good to play when you were in one of the javelins, I believe they called them.
Yep.
And it was just trying to be Destiny. Or any other, shared world shooter, and it completely fell flat on its face because even though the development time was actually substantially longer than a lot of other games, including good games, get, it was just never set up for success in that sense. And I did play through all of Anthem. I've actually beaten Anthem, what you could generously call the story of Anthem, twice, because it's actually just quite easy. It's just that everything, and the story was terrible, but the gameplay was good, and it felt good enough that I wanted to keep playing it. I just never gave a crap about anyone I was playing with, because I could have played that game solo and would have had the exact same experience.
Well, the flying was a lot of fun. I will say they really did nail the flying mechanics, but
the flying
it really
mechanic
was an
great.
example of them being like you said, we want a looter shooter game, not knowing how to build a looter shooter game, not really having a team that, has done that before, and just putting BioWare on it and be like, you figure this out, right? Which is the complete opposite of Larian. Like, Larian has been making these games. I'm not at all surprised that when they were like, we want to mess with the D&D IP, Wizards of the Coast was like, yeah, sure, 100%, cool, yeah. Like,
well,
they've been making
Divinity,
these kind of
Divinity is Divinity reminded me more of Baldur's Gate than any game I've played since I played the original Baldur's Gate. So yeah, no, of course they would do that. So I mean, you have to deal with that licensing issue, and after that, you have carte blanche. Like, you're golden, and you have this, like we said already, successfully experienced team of people who have made these types of RPGs so often. It's just awesome to kind of see that happen. In contrast, we got Anthem, and then there are some other bits and pieces. Did you have anywhere you wanted to go with Anthem on this one?
No,
outside
I mean,
of what I said.
I don't think. I think my biggest thing with Anthem was just mentioning kind of the lack of feature completeness. Outside of that, I mean, did it have a cash shop? I can't remember.
Yes,
I think it did.
Yes, it did.
Well, I don't think it was out enough to come off as like a particularly greedy game. But, of course, Baldur's has no cash shop or microtransactions. So I guess in that way, that kind of...
Well, that is a huge thing. And I suppose now we're just going to kind of talk about some of the other AAA games that have come out that don't... Especially ones that try to tout themselves as being narratively driven, I should say. We're talking about your one of my favorite examples, and I'm going to start with a single player, is Assassin's Creed Valhalla. Probably the only Assassin's Creed game I will just never finish, because the endless stream of content and the number of microtransactions, the number of opportunities to buy experience instead of playing the game was exhausting. The degree to which the game kept getting longer became exhausting. And, it launched in a steady sort of performance state, but it just kept throwing all that stuff at you so often that at a certain point, I mean, me personally, I got really tired of doing the exact same thing over and over again. And it's not that the combat was bad. It's not that the visuals were bad. It's not that the game didn't have enough budget. It's not the game didn't have enough time. It was just that constant, drip of content became overwhelming at a certain point. But I mean, in terms of feature complete, you could look at, again, like a Jedi Survivor, which did launch feature complete, but performance bad.
Or our other game that we've talked about, which is Cyberpunk, which I would argue,
Kentucky Fried Cyberpunk.
I would actually argue maybe it wasn't feature complete since they've added so many different things.
I would argue that it was 100% not feature complete. I would agree with that wholeheartedly.
It was feature complete in the sense that, like, all the features were in the game. They didn't really strip anything out necessarily, but the biggest issue was it didn't run well. Like what people are going to remember about it in terms of, like, why are AAA games letting people down as in comparison to Baldur's Gate, right?
Yeah.
It's definitely the fact that it just did not run well.
See,
it obviously runs better now, but it took I think like a year, and they're still making massive changes to the game.
which is fine. I mean, like, save the baby. Save the baby. The baby's drowning. Save the baby. I'm good with that. You shouldn't have released the game when you did on the systems that you released it on, but save the baby. I'm fine with that. My issue is that there's a difference between feature complete and feature cohesion, right? Cyberpunk, as this high profile, biggest selling fucking game in the history of whatever the hell, just absolutely landed on its face and forced companies that don't do return policies for digital copies to do returns for digital copies. It got pulled from the PlayStation Store. It wasn't feature complete. It was technically feature complete. It also just wasn't finished. And there's a huge difference there. But I would also argue that there is a caveat to feature complete where all the features technically there, yes. Did they function outside of the visual and frame rate and, general performance of the game? Did those mechanics actually function as intended? I would argue no. That's actually what drove me away from the game as opposed to the visual glitches. Like, we talked about, like, a tree showing up in a building that you were in, and, I'm like, okay, that takes me out of it a little bit, but I can deal with it. The game just didn't feel good to play. The features were there. Were they completed? No, in my opinion. The mechanics of the game just didn't work. Yeah. That's my opinion on that. And I think with another year to polish, it's possible that they could have come up with something thanks to the hard work of our friends in QA.
Well, it's one of those, yeah. Well, one, yes, bless all the people in QA. They're very important, so show some love. But the thing with these kind of games, right? You mentioned Jedi Survivor. I was super excited for Jedi Survivor before it came out. Then the game came out. It was notoriously awful at running on PC, which is the platform I would have played it on. And I was just like, you know what? I'm going to wait until it gets better. But honestly, I forget that it even came out this year because it just lost so much momentum because it didn't run well. And in terms of just like AAA games coming off as snooze fests or not being impressive, like, I think that's a huge component is we've got all these games that are releasing with all these huge issues. I mean, I already mentioned it on one of the previous episodes, but the port of The Last of Us Part 1 to PC was a similar fate. It was a bad port. There were a lot of visual issues. I think there were some performance issues outside of that as well. And, that just loses a lot of steam for these games and makes AAA look like a incredibly lazy segment of games. Like, regardless of the reality of how much work is actually being put in, what matters to a degree is what the consumer, interprets from the actions and how they see things, right? And I'm not at all surprised that consumers think there's a lot of laziness going on, when obviously a ton of developers are working very, very hard to get this content out. But it's just hard to not see that, especially when games like Baldur's Gate come out and they largely perform really well. That being said, Baldur's Gate definitely has issues, and it has a ton of glitches that I would refer to as like AA charm. I do want to just get that out there. I've had crashes. I've had weird camera freeze locks where the game's still playing, but it forces me into a certain camera position. There's been tons of weird glitches in cinematics. It's very similar, Aaron, to like Bethesda glitches.
Yeah, which I am notoriously a fan of.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of that, if I'm being honest. Like cutscenes where your character should be sitting, but they're standing up. But it's in a position where it's weird that they're standing up. Tons of that kind of stuff. But given the scope of the game, I guess it kind of makes sense to a degree. But I guess where I'm going with this is none of the issues with Baldur's Gate are big enough that they justify as much criticism as some of these other games. But there definitely are some issues.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think any work of art is ever good enough to be absolved of criticism. Again, one of my actual favorite movie on the planet, Synecdoche, New York, is like a completely even split on something like Rotten Tomatoes or something like that.
Yeah.
That's totally justified based on the nature of the experience that you're having. So again, it's not to say that, but I still think I think it's a brilliant, impactful film. But there are so many different caveats to all of this that, there's no reason anything good should be absolved of criticism. So you've played how many hours you say you played in Baldur's Gate 3?
Probably about like 40.
Okay, 40 hours. You have some issues, but you still like the game. Great. Why not address those issues? Don't ignore them. Don't pretend they don't exist. Just, enjoy the parts of the game you like and appreciate them, and then say like, hey, here's what you could improve. I don't see that as being any particular issue. I also think that in the AAA space, and then we can move to talking about a couple of other, kind of contrasting titles in smaller spaces, which it seems Larian has kind of taken the position of a little bit. But I think for AAA, visual fidelity especially, is at the forefront. Again, I will make exceptions for games like The Last of Us or The Last of Us Part 2, not the PC port of the first one. That's a performance issue, but it kind of leads into what I'm talking about, which is that the visual fidelity of a game like Jedi Survivor and the IP that it's attached to are the selling points of the game. What keeps you is the gameplay. And if your game doesn't perform and people just start talking about that, that's going to be a really challenging hurdle to kind of jump over in terms of winning people and selling a shit ton of copies, which is what a publisher would want.
Yeah. I mean, that's definitely, I definitely agree. I definitely think the IP gets people in the door. And obviously Jedi Survivor is the sequel to a pretty successful Star Wars game that EA worked on. So there's obviously that component. The last thing I would like to say before we look at some of the smaller examples of studios or games rather not falling into these, traps, is I do think it's important to bring up the fact that when a consumer perspective, there really is a feeling that these studios are just trying to milk you dry for cash.
Yes, no, that is an important one to bring up.
And I think that's illustrated by things like the Red Dead Redemption re-release for PS4 and Switch, which is $50.
I'm sorry. Actually, it's called a conversion now.
Conversion. Whatever it's called, you can basically get the same game for Xbox 360 at $30, assuming you have an Xbox 360. But apparently on Amazon, it's selling for $30. If you get it used,
that's
you
brand
can probably
new.
get it even cheaper.
If you wanted to go buy the Game of the Year edition that came out for PS3 or Xbox 360 on disc at a GameStop, supposing they have one, you could probably get it for like $11, and that's at the high end.
Yep. And people look at that and they're like, what the heck is this? Like, it's cool they're re-releasing it for platforms it's not on now, but how is that not to be viewed as a blatant cash grab when they're not making any improvements? And then two of the other things that I mentioned, Aaron, during our discussion, or actually, sorry, I guess I only really mentioned one of them, but is Destiny 2 citing opportunity cost as a reason that they're not investing more in PvP, which is a huge segment of the community's like main focus and interest. Is they want more maps, they want more attention, and Destiny's basically been telling them, we don't have the studio staff or resources to support that, while funneling a ton of energy and effort into the Eververse store, which for those that aren't familiar is their in-game cash shop, where they come up with tons of different cosmetics to purchase and for people to spend their money on. So as Michael kind of jokingly calls it, we're referencing Bellular a lot here because a lot of our resources, or a lot of mine for this, are from that. But he calls them consumption opportunities. It does definitely seem like a lot of studios are focusing on consumption opportunities for players and not on, gameplay opportunities, finding the fun, delighting players. And I definitely think that's a situation where Baldur's has no microtransactions. There is no in-game shop. The closest thing it comes to it is there was a deluxe edition, I believe, or the pre-order edition that I got some free cosmetic stuff because I had the game in early access. That's like the extent to which I have things that other people don't. And I think people see a lot of this investment in cash shops and trying to extract money from players, and they're like, oh, that's where your effort's going. And I completely understand why that's frustrating when it feels like the game and gameplay are being neglected, but the cash shop is seeing like a massive amount of content, launched.
Yeah. No, I think that is an important component. I'm glad you brought it up, just because I won't even bother naming many examples on this one, but single player story driven games. It doesn't have to be an RPG. It can be anything. Single player, and this one doesn't have to be single player, which is the interesting part. Mm-hmm. But games like, okay, I'm gonna go back to my old whippin' boy Assassin's Creed Unity, and just the number of currencies that are in that game, most if not all of which you can purchase with real cash, are in there. We're talking about the Resident Evil 4 remake, where they added basically a way to pay your way through certain portions of the game for extra currency.
Yeah.
In a resource management heavy action game.
And that game still got positive reception, which was...
And it still got positive reception. It launched to great acclaim, and it launched to, very, very solid player experience. But after the fact, and we talked about this in another episode, I guess we're just doing the greatest hits of all time here now.
It is the season end, so it makes sense.
It is the season end. Yeah, we got to do our bottle episode. That kind of action in a single player, like a narrative driven game, is bonkers. Diablo 4 is another fantastic example. Why is Diablo 4? I mean, it obviously has gotten fantastic reviews, but Baldur's Gate seems to have absolutely demolished Diablo in this moment, just because Diablo's kind of fluctuating atmosphere in terms of it being constantly updated. It's online, it's getting patched, the patch sucks, everyone's pissed about the patch, now we're going this way. We're we're talking about two different worlds of game making, and I think that's worth taking note of if you are either a game developer or an aspiring game developer. Zach, you specifically, definitely not the larger audience. Is interesting because this game just like it's just now here, and I have it now. It's just there. And there'll be changes, there'll be bug fixes and stuff like that, but it's not trying to charge you more than you already paid for the same experience. It's not trying to upsell you on a better experience. It's just a finished game that you can play and have largely the same experience as opposed to a couple of skins for the deluxe edition. Why not? Like, hey, make your money. I'm fine with that. You worked on this thing for 6 years. You want to sell a deluxe edition if someone wants to buy it, someone wants to get into early access and get something for it. That's completely fine in my book. But there's a complete difference between that and like, charging $15 for story missions in Overwatch 2. Completely different story. And I think that people could take a little bit of a moment and learn from this as an idea of like a finished game that was released and well polished.
And the crazy thing about Baldur's, if I'm remembering back correctly, and I could be wrong, I don't have it pulled up right now, but I don't believe I even spent $60 on the game. I believe it was a $50 game. I could be wrong there. But where I'm going with this is there's a lot of games, like you alluded to earlier, that are kind of carrying the zeitgeist, so to speak, a lot more. Yeah. And they're not these, $60 or $70 AAA games. They are games, some of which are only like $10. Vampire Survivor, as an example, kind of took over the world by storm for a little bit. And I think it's
free on mobile.
Is it? Oh, it's free on mobile?
It's free on mobile.
Oh, well, it's free on mobile. I think on PC it's maybe like $8. But like, I just pulled some of the metrics at the bottom of the notes here so I could just, read that off. But Vampire Survivor, 97. Oh my gosh, I just burped in the mic. My bad. 97% overwhelmingly positive. I haven't played Dave the Diver, but that's kind of a similarly, it's like an indie darling game that came out this year, was in early access for a long time, but it's 96% overwhelmingly positive. I did play Dredge. I love that game. It's an Eldritch horror like fishing game. 95% overwhelmingly positive. We talked about BattleBit on an episode, and that is 87% very positive. I mean, a lot of these games have kind of taken over where I think AAA would have a lot of attention in the past, and it's because they're just games. Some of them might have microtransactions, but I think all the ones that I mentioned don't. And they're like, everything's just there. Feature complete, good game. There's no, ands or buts to that, really.
Yeah. Vampire Survivor on mobile does have options to boost by purchasing something, I believe. But that's because it's the free version on mobile, which is the one that I've played the most. And
I actually hadn't even realized you played it.
I think that is kind of an important thing to bring up as we rapidly approach the end of this, the final episode of season 2, is that these AA games, Zach had said, I'm now talking directly to the audience. Not to you, Zach, so you can plug your ears. Zach had said something about, like, indie and AA make the wave. AAA rides it. And that's not 100% true. It is mostly true, though. You've got games like Tears of the Kingdom and Breath of the Wild that completely break the mold in terms of what you should expect from a AAA game. But then you've got games that are inexplicably successful, like Stardew Valley, developed by one person and published by a small publisher, which changed the landscape and has spawned many clones. We've got, games like Night of the Necro Dancer. I want to
Yes,
say
that is a game.
which is a rhythm-based dungeon crawler roguelike. And there's just this wealth of creativity in what is it called? Dave the Hat Man, David with Hat.
I have no idea what you're talking about. Honestly, I don't know that one. I know Dave the Diver.
Dave the Diver. I'm sorry. There's another one about a guy who has a hat shop that it has made best of the year lists so far by outlets like Polygon, which means that it's getting mainstream attention, and they're innovative and they're creative and they're coming from someone's raw creativity, personality, something like that. And I think what we're talking about is the kind of dichotomy between this wonderful little indie film that someone made and maybe makes a splash, but definitely resonates with a lot of other people, and the Eternals by Marvel and Disney. There's so much more creativity going into these that I think they are to some degree capturing the zeitgeist, and I think to some degree they're also driving the industry forward, and hopefully teaching the right lessons to the larger budget, more financially successful industry and the people at the top of it, to make games that are a little bit outside the box, make games that are personal, make games that'll connect with people, come up with a new mechanic, come up with something crazy. It's one of the weird moments playing Tears of the Kingdom. I'm like, I could not imagine anyone other than Nintendo coming up with the fuse mechanic in Tears of the Kingdom, where you can attach just about anything to anything. It's that's a very AA indie mentality that not to end our long-standing feud with Nintendo, but it does feel very independently minded, in my opinion. And these games are getting a lot more attention. I would even say like It Takes Two, another one that we talked about, is an example of that. Even though that's not a small budget studio, but it is very independently minded.
Yeah, I mean, I think the real thing that kind of gets exemplified is that a lot of studios, well, I won't even say it's studios, a lot of publishers want to follow in the footsteps of what they know will be successful in an attempt to reduce risk. So I'm sure after Baldur's Gate, yeah, and I'm sure after Baldur's Gate comes out, there'll be a ton of publishers that are like, "Oh, we need our D&D based game." And then what they're going to do is they're going to look at all this data to justify that decision, and they're going to ride the wave. And when I said that, Aaron, the wave is the data. It's the security in making a, at least from a data perspective, smart decision. But indie companies are much more focused on fun. So in my opinion, they're more willing to take risks to innovate and do, these genre changes or new mechanics or whatever it might be. And that's really what, drives innovation, makes games feel fun, makes it feel like the people working on the game actually enjoyed making the game, is when it's not just chasing a trend and trying to be overly data driven, right?
I mean, that is the backstory to Anthem. 100% is they saw successful shared world loot shooters and said, well, we have a studio who can maybe do that, and then they threw it right at them, and the result was absolute garbage, except for the fact that the flying mechanic did actually feel really good.
That was the only thing.
And the combat wasn't bad.
I mean, the combat wasn't bad. It was passable, but it definitely didn't feel like a like what you should get out of a AAA quality game.
Well, I mean, it was repetitive. It was fairly generic, repetitive, but mostly satisfying. That's not the entire point, though. Mm-hmm. The point being that these independent studios, whether they be AAA, AA, or completely indie, look at Stardew Valley. People making something that they're either passionate about, experienced in, or a combination of the two makes for a good game. And chasing trends rarely results in exceptional success, I guess is what I'll say. And I mean, even though D&D is probably more popular now than it has been in a very long time, it seems like Baldur's Gate has done that. And the team at Larian should be celebrated and learned from rather than chased, in my opinion. If you try and chase that, you might not hit the same level of quality because you're only chasing it. It's like my friend has a Nintendo. I don't play games, but I need to catch up with my friend in terms of being cool. That's a bad reason to buy a video game console. It's also a bad reason to make a video game. So, I guess that's just my caveat to that.
I mean, instead of being cool, they're trying to make money. But I do. I mean, I know what you're.
Right. I mean,
I know
that was
what
a metaphor.
Yeah. I know what you're getting at. Yeah. I mean, I think in the end, that's really kind of like the big summary here of everything is what we're here to talk about. What the whole purpose of this episode has been around is to just illustrate that Larian made a game that I'm sure they thought would make money. But
they absolutely have had to. For 6 years of development time, they would have had to convince somebody that it would make money.
Well, I think the more interesting thing is it's the games that they've already been making. So it wasn't them going out and being like, oh, we need to chase this trend that we have no business chasing, right? A lot of publishers put studios and developers in situations to make games that I don't think they have any right to make. And when I say that, I mean more that they don't have experience making these really big games. And as Michael said it in the Bellular video, it's kind of this AAA hubris. And I think what we're seeing a lot now is a lot of AAA hubris and failed games because of it. Games trying to be the highest level of graphical fidelity and failing because most people can't run their game because it's not optimized well. Talking to you, Jedi Survivor, games, that just shouldn't exist because X company doesn't have experience making a large MMO kind of game. Talking to you, Anthem, talking to you, Fallout 76, although Fallout 76 is apparently a lot better now than it used to be at launch. My point here is that I think it's all of these issues kind of come together. All of this trend chasing, all of this risk aversion comes together. And at least for me, Aaron, it creates an atmosphere where AAA games, which used to be my favorite segment because, they were generally always polished. The scale was so big. It was what everyone else was playing. They were fun. It's starting to not be that anymore for me. It's starting to be a situation where AAA games most of the time are going to be buggy messes. There's going to be a lot of drama surrounding it. There's going to be a lot of like annoying microtransaction bullshit I don't want to deal with. And they're just like the soul of a lot of these games is just kind of sapped out of them. AAA more so now, sure, it means big budget, but I don't think it means good. I think there was a time where AAA typically meant that there was a certain standard that was being met. And that is definitely not the case anymore. And the last thing I'll say before shutting up is I did some quick Google searching last night when I was kind of pulling together all of our notes. There's a lot of people that feel the same way. If you just go on Reddit or if you just type in AAA feels tired or, just do some Google searches, there's a lot of different articles talking about how AAA is not in a good spot right now. And that's kind of what I wanted to exemplify through this episode and specifically using Baldur's Gate is it's just weird. AAA is in a very weird spot. And I think they need to make a lot of changes or they risk kind of permanently ruining and staining what it means to be a AAA game.
No, I would actually completely agree with that. Also, I do apologize if you hear any scratching sounds in the background. My cat is trying to velociraptor my door open. So I
You're like, wait
apologize for that.
5 more minutes. We're almost done, damn it.
I know, man. It's good. Now we good. No, I completely agree. I feel like when, because I'll always remember, because I used to have Game Informer magazine, and I really loved reading through those when I was younger. And I will never forget the one where the cover image was Assassin's Creed 2. And I really wanted to play Assassin's Creed 2 because I looked at it and I saw that there was this crazy mechanic where you could decrease your notoriety. And I was like, man, I've been playing Game Boy games. This is nothing. So the actions you take in the game, and again, for Assassin's Creed 2 now within the modern context, that is so basic in terms of social interaction in a game based around social stealth that I went, I really must have a video game that does this, and I love the aesthetic, and it looks incredible. And for a long time, indie games also didn't have a platform as big as they do now, with both digital distribution and basically all of the large publishers supporting indie games in some way. I was just all the way in on AAA games. I'm like, I got to catch up. I got to play all these huge games that everyone has already been playing. I was in the chemistry lab in high school, and my friend just wouldn't shut the fuck up about Black Ops. And I didn't have a system that could play them at that point. I had a Wii. You know, that's not exactly your best first person shooter experience.
What was that? Power.
Yeah. But it was an interesting kind of place to be, where I was just like, you know, these are the big games. These are the ones that matter. And increasingly now, the smaller studios, be they AA or completely indie, are really driving this idea forward, and the idea that innovation is still wow, that cat's just really going to town, isn't he? Man, that's gonna make for some good listening. The AAA games are coming out, and they're marketing themselves mostly based on fidelity and IP, realistically. And some of them come out very good. Again, I'll go back to The Last of Us Part 2 and say that that game, which is obviously AAA, doesn't really push things forward in terms of gameplay, but it does push things forward in terms of narrative and what you should expect from a video game narrative. I think there's still opportunity for that sort of thing to exist in the AAA space, but the vast majority of your Ubisofts, your EAs, your Activisions, it's so profit motivated that the creativity is gone. And so people who care about the experience of playing a game and treat the experience as its own form of art are looking towards those smaller mid-range studios as well as indie games. And it feels like, in a rare example of a AAA studio taking those lessons and saying, I'm making this for someone to enjoy, not explicitly for someone to pay me for. Baldur's Gate 3 has managed to catch the kind of vibe of a AA studio, even though it was made by a large team over the course of a long time with a lot of funding, and it's making, I have to assume, boatloads of money. It has managed to catch that sort of idea and synthesize it into something that people are actually responding to in a very positive way. And I think that the best thing for AAA studios, the best thing AAA studios could do would be to learn from that and say, hey, you can still sell a lot of copies of a game that does not include microtransactions, a game that does not add microtransactions later, a game that doesn't have 43 different types of currency. It's just a game. And it was made by people who cared about what they were making. That is my assumption. I do not know anyone who works at Larian. But it does seem to be kind of like a flare shot, like, you know, those flare guns. You shoot one up and it just kind of is a little firework gun.
I do know of the flare gun.
The flare gun, yes. It does in fact seem to be something of that type, or dare I hope that it is, because it is a large budget game. It is a large game. It is dominating headlines within the industry, and it feels to me like what's going on here is, again, they've learned from the people who care about the games they're making, sometimes because they have to. They can't make the game if they don't care about it, you know, and they can't make the game. They can't fight to get publishing. They can't fight to get it on any platform, unless they, you know, really, if they don't get that secured, then their apartment is gone or their house is gone. There's a level of I would say like intimacy to the concept that I think is refreshing, and you just don't see that very much in AAA games. It's very rare to see it in AAA games, and it seems as if Baldur's Gate will be doing that. I will probably, on my own side, tweet my impressions, my impressions of Baldur's Gate once I finally get a chance to play it, now that it's finally downloaded on my Steam Deck. But yeah, no, I think there's just so much interesting kind of context to place around the massive success that has been Baldur's Gate 3.
Yep. And the last thing before we get to thank yous in closing, I did just want to mention, if you're curious what Aaron was just talking about losing a home and pressures and whatnot, Aaron was trying to condense a very complicated subject into a 5-minute description, which is very difficult, if nigh impossible. If you want to know more about what he's alluding to, we did do an episode on Press Reset and specifically talked a lot about publishers and how they can positively and negatively impact game development for studios. I would highly recommend that you read the book, one, but also check out the episode, because it's hard to succinctly describe the pressures of development while also talking about what we're talking about. So,
absolutely. And I'm sorry that I talked for so long there. I will apologize for the rest of my life. But the other one you should read, it's another Jason Schreier book, The Second Patron Saint of Some Patches Required. Check out Blood, Sweat, and Pixels, because they talk about the development of Stardew Valley. They talk about the development of Shovel Knight, as well as several other AAA games that really kind of illustrate the dichotomy between, you know, a stably, in scare quotes, employed person at a AAA studio and someone who's, you know, putting it all on the line to make something they really believe in, based out of their, you know, bedroom.
Yeah,
it's a good book. But yeah, that's more or less what I was trying to describe. I apologize if that was not clear.
No. I didn't even necessarily think it wasn't. I just know we have an episode. I was more doing a shout out.
Oh no, we're good. No, we got to get Jason. Hey, Jason Schreier. I know I asked this before, but please, would you do it? Would you be on the show?
Maybe. We first need to actually hit him up. So that's probably a good first step. I don't know that he.
That's
just
probably
listens,
the best first step, as it turns out. Yeah. Also, listen to Triple Click. It's a pretty good show.
That's
Jason
true.
Schreier's
he has
podcast.
his own podcast that is worth listening to. Alana Pierce also has a podcast. I haven't listened to hers, so I don't know if it's good or not. I'm now diverging from the topic that matters. Regardless, check out Game Podcasts. They're cool. especially ones that talk a little bit more about things that aren't just reviews. Not that there's anything wrong with reviews for games, but there's a lot going on in the industry outside of just enjoying games, and it's cool to learn about it, I guess.
The Besties is a good one.
Yeah, Aaron will put them in the show notes. I don't know.
Yes, Aaron will put them in the show notes. I have decided this. Yeah, no, I can throw those in there.
In the show notes.
But in the meantime, after I have now bloviated for an exceptionally long time, I figure I might as well start us on the lead out, unless you had any closing notes, Zach, because I did do an incredibly long monologue.
No, I hit most of my key points already.
Okay. Well, anywho, I now no longer have time to play very much of Baldur's Gate before I must attend to other obligations, but I will be playing it, and I will probably, whatever they call a tweet now, out what I'm thinking. If anyone gives a shit, which, I mean, to be honest with you, I wouldn't, but if you do, that's awesome, and I love you. In the meantime, you know what is something to give a shit about?
Beach Girl.
It's the music of Beach Girl. Yeah, it's the music of Beach Girl. I absolutely love Beach Girl. They have some wonderful music on their own, and they provided our wonderful, wonderful, wonderful intro and outro music. And I actually dove perhaps back into the backlog, because they had a previous band called Electric Guitar, and I started listening to that music again, and I love it as much as I love Beach Girl stuff, and they are just absolutely fantastic. So do feel free to follow them on any of their social medias, whichever ones it is that they still currently have operational, and the names of which have not changed within the last 72 hours or somewhat. And give them a little follow on Bandcamp, Spotify. There's a YouTube presence. Check out the music of Beach Girl and Electric Guitar, and enjoy the way that your ears feel, because it will be a good one.
I would like to say thank you to EW Art,
right?
for all of the wonderful art and artistic things that she has done for us. We definitely appreciate it. Make sure to check her out on Instagram or on Etsy with the handle at @EWGieArt. Show some love for our friend. I know she'll appreciate it. We'll appreciate it. Spread the love. We appreciate you. And I think on that note, as we already had mentioned, but in case you missed it, this is the final episode of season 2. We will be back with more content once we've, kind of gotten enough of a head start on some of the interviews and larger episodes that we want to do. Yeah, we'll be around. And thanks everybody for the support this season. We definitely appreciate it.
Absolutely. And we also might have a couple of fun little additions to the standard some patches required bit. And we're not exactly sure how well those will coalesce, but we might have some exciting stuff for you coming up soon. We won't be gone for very long, but we will be gone for a little bit. Thank you so much again for all of us. And is it your and remember, Zach?
And remember,
or is it, I mean, I can just come up with one right quick.
No, it's fine. And remember that apparently Baldur's Gate is either not sexual enough or too sexual. So when recommending games for your kids to play this holiday season, perhaps don't recommend Baldur's Gate if your child is under the age of 18, or you don't want them to see elf titties and vulva, both of which can be on display in the game pretty much whenever you want. It's a horny game. That's my final
and
closing
remember
thought.
that in real life you shouldn't fuck a bear.
Yes, that is also true. Remember, do not fuck a bear. It's only okay in Baldur's Gate because it's a druid, and druids are sentient because you see that druids are actually sentient beings. In this case, it's an elf man that's very
I love
big
how
and
long
small.
this. I love how long this is going.
You should just do a fade out as I'm talking about one.
Okay, okay. Continue talking then. Goodbye.
And you see, an elf is a character with big pointy ears. It's a species
That's pretty good, right?